the Waterfront Ghoul. The River Mersey has been the scene of many maritime mysteries over the years. I have mentioned cases in the past about ships like the SS President and the City of Glasgow, which left Liverpool in the 19th century and literally vanished without any trace of wreckage, even though they disappeared right in the middle of the busy shipping lanes. There have even been eerie instances of ships vanishing in the middle of the Mersey, within sight of the liver buildings. In September 1943, a large steamship, the Speak, set out from Birkenhead, bound for Preston. The ship was to steam up the coast and make a simple turning into the Ribble before docking at Preston. But for some bizarre and unaccountable reason, the ship literally vanished from sight near Bootle Docks in broad daylight. The ship was seen steaming along one moment by lookouts on the tip of the Wirral Peninsula at Wallasey. Then the next instant, she was nowhere to be seen. Scores of dockers up at the Seafort and Gladstone docks stared in disbelief because seconds before they had been watching the steamer on her short journey up the river. Now the ship had somehow vanished, as if the sea had suddenly swallowed her up. The port authorities were naturally baffled at the 217-ton vessel's vanishing act because not one stick of wreckage was ever found. As it was the middle of the Second World War, it was originally feared that a German U-boat had torpedoed the steamer, but there was no explosion on the river. Because it was wartime, the authorities never gave the weird incident much more thought and concerned themselves instead with the Nazi menace. But curiously, after about 5 months after the ship had disappeared, at the end of January 1944, 2 elderly night watchmen at Gladstone docks witnessed a spine-chilling spectacle in the early hours of one bitterly cold winter's morning. A full moon shone down on the river, making the waves of the Mersey sparkle with a silvery light. One of the night watchmen was sitting warming himself in front of a rusty old oil drum filled with burning sticks of wood and a few lumps of coal. His name was Jerry, and his mate Arthur was in a hut on the quayside brewing a pot of tea. As Jerry rubbed his hands together in front of the fire, he yawned, then idly stared out at the moonlit waters of the Mersey. Suddenly, he caught sight of something which made him shiver with fear. A black, shadowy figure was emerging from the waves, walking out of the Mersey about 200 yards out from the dockside. Jerry's stomach turned over. He thought the figure was obviously some German frogman coming ashore from a submarine somewhere in the river. He was probably on a mission to sabotage the ships berthed at the docks. Although Jerry was 70, he leapt to his feet and raced towards the hut as fast as his legs could carry him. Wide-eyed and panting with fear, he stammered out an account of what he had seen to his mate, who panicked and seized the receiver of an old wind-up telephone mounted on the wall of the hut. "What are you doing, Arthur?" Jerry asked. "Calling the police and the Home Guard." He wound up the phone, then swore as the operator took ages to answer his call. Eventually, a weary girl's voice answered, and Arthur asked her to contact the Home Guard urgently. 20 minutes later, a small overweight man in uniform, accompanied by a motley assortment of 8 men, all over 60, turned up in an old taxi at the docks. It was the captain of the local Home Guard unit and his men. The soldiers made a thorough search of all the Gladstone and Hornby docks, then moved on to search the Seafort dock, but none of the watchmen or fire wardens up there reported seeing anyone come ashore. The captain and his men ended up sitting around the night watchman's fire, amicably chatting and cooking baked potatoes. They left at 6 a.m. after the captain had sarcastically hinted that Jerry had been experiencing a so-called open-eye dream, the product of a tired and overwrought mind. Jerry was furious at the suggestion. But on the following morning at 3:30, Jerry again saw the creepy-looking figure emerging from the freezing waters of the Mersey. Arthur was sipping his tea while roasting a round of his wife's homemade bread over the fire. He almost dropped the slice into the brazier as Jerry came up behind him and nudged his arm. "Arthur, look, there it is again," This time Arthur saw the figure too. He quickly took out a small brass folding telescope, pulled it open, and trained it on the silhouette. "Oh, my God! What is it? Let's have a look. What can you see?" said Jerry, impatiently making incessant grabs at the spyglass like an overexcited child. Arthur looked terrified, and he handed the telescope to his friend with a trembling hand. By the time Jerry looked down at the river, he only caught a fleeting glimpse of the figure disappearing behind the dock wall. Arthur suddenly stood up and looked towards the thing and cried, "It's coming up the steps of the dock wall." "No, it's gone," sighed Jerry with relief. "Thank God." But suddenly there in the moonlight, a mere 150 yards away, the figure reappeared. It limped slowly and menacingly up the stairs towards the night watchman. Jerry levelled the telescope at the figure and took a closer look at it. A big mistake. The magnified image almost gave him a heart attack. It was a walking corpse. A partly decomposed male figure wearing a dark, ragged overcoat and black trousers. His face was a greenish white, puffed up and deeply wrinkled, as if he had been in the water for some time. His torso looked hollow, and something vile dangled from the cavity under his exposed ribcage. "Jesus!" gasped Jerry, and recoiled in terror, staggering backwards. The figure speeded up and started to trot towards the frightened night watchman with a strange loping gait. He ran diagonally towards the dock gate as if he sensed that that was the only way they could escape. Arthur and Jerry fled to the hut and bolted themselves in. They waited and waited for what seemed like an eternity. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, persistent footsteps coming towards the hut. Arthur grabbed the Bakelite handle of the phone in such a nervous state that it broke off in his hand, making it impossible to telephone for help. To make matters even worse, Jerry accidentally head-butted the oil lantern hanging from the ceiling, and it crashed down to the floor and went out. The hut was plunged into total darkness, except for a beam of moonlight streaming through the small window. Suddenly, the beam was interrupted as a terribly disfigured face peered through the window at the terrorized men. The face was crinkled and livid white, tinged with green. Strands of what looked like seaweed hung from the open jaw like saliva. One of the eyes was hanging from its socket by the loosened optic nerve, and the other eye rolled about sickeningly. As the zombie-like head opened its jaws, a repugnant pale-coloured liquid spurted out with a gurgling noise and splashed against the hut windows. The thing sounded as if it was struggling to say something. It pounded on the window and repeatedly pointed towards the sea's horizon and moaned. Then, for no apparent reason, it slowly turned and moved away from the window. Jerry and Arthur listened intently to the sound of heavy footsteps squelching away from the hut. After about 20 minutes, during which time they had not spoken a single word, Jerry turned towards his friend and whispered, "As soon as I open the door, run to the gate." But even as he spoke, the door began to squeak. The handle of the door was turning. The despicable thing was still outside. It started to groan again and knocked heavily on the door. It slithered back to the window and peered in again. This time the loose eyeball was missing, and the grotesque face rammed against the window, almost breaking it. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure finally walked off into the night. All the same, the terrified pair refused to move from that hut until the sun came up. Shortly after dawn, Jerry cautiously emerged from the hut and immediately slipped on something just outside the door. To his horror, when he looked down, he saw what appeared to be a squashed eyeball clinging to his shoe. He almost threw up and kicked it away in disgust. The squashed object rolled off the quayside and plopped into the muddy waters of the Mersey. The night watchman told the police all about the horrific-looking figure, but were accused of seeing things after drinking on duty. But Arthur and Jerry stuck rigidly to their strange tale until their deaths in the 1950s. Just a few years ago, the ship that had vanished in the Mersey was finally found intact on the bed of the river near Liverpool Bay. 4 skeletons of the Speaks crew were located within the wreck, encrusted with barnacles. But the body of the 5th crew member was never found, and no one has ever found out why it was not in the sunken ship. Unless, perhaps, the 5th crew member was actually the decomposed ghoul which terrorised the night watchman at Bootle Docks, which are a mere stone's throw from the spot where the ship went down. Strangely enough, in the winter of 1997, 2 security guards spotted a silhouette emerging from the sea near the lighthouse at the Gladstone dock at 4 o'clock in the morning. The guards immediately alerted the police, but the man was never found. Nevertheless, he was seen by the guards regularly over 2 weeks, always coming from the shore. An Alsatian dog belonging to one of the guards still refuses to go near a certain stretch of the Gladstone dock, where the figure is often seen. Could this sinister entity be the very same Waterfront Ghoul who terrorised the night watchman during the war?